All right, here we go. Kinesiology 230. This is chapter 23, resistance training for clients who are athletes. And I'm also going to delve a little bit more into like athletics in general. This is presentation number 3 here, and we'll talk a little bit about periodization and of resistance training. This is found on page 623. If we go back to our chapter breakdown, our bullet points within the chapter itself, this is number 3 out of 4. And then the fifth bullet point will be some side presentations that I'll give from my background and my experience. So periodization is a systematic process of planned variations in resistance training program over a training cycle. And I mentioned before that periodization used to have a slightly different definition, where it was the scientific manipulation of rep and set combinations or training stimulus to elicit the optimal training response while minimizing the risk of injury. I like them both. They've got, this is the newer version of I've seen for periodization. But I just remember from back when I was in school years ago, that was the definition. So the goal is to manipulate the volume and intensity. And we've talked a little bit about that just in terms of just training in general and workouts in general, of the overall volume and the intensity. And we'll talk more in depth here in a little bit. But the overall likelihood of injury is reduced, and the overall likelihood of overtraining is also reduced as well when you have a systematic, well thought out program that aligns with different periodization models that are pretty easily accessible in the industry. You can kind of find these different models, and we'll talk a little bit about a couple here in our next presentations. But when you get into the actual coaching side of it, there's the scientific side, but also there's the artistic interpretation side, where you as a coach get to have your own influence and input into program design. So I would urge you to maybe reference what we're talking about today, reference these things as a fundamental or foundational component, and then branch off and do your own stuff as well. So the book focuses on 2 main areas, cycles and phases being one of them, and then variation and exercise selection being the other. So if we go in with periodization, we have cycles and phases. Let me get myself out of the way here. With the cycles and phases, you have on a much smaller scale, you have microcycles, and then you go mesocycles and macrocycles. Microcycle, very much like a microscope. You use a microscope to see small things. Macro, you think macroeconomics, it's big picture economics. Meso, you can think of in terms of you're out on the mezzanine, or you're on the mezzanine in a theater, which is the in-between levels. Or if you're into music, it could be like a mezzo soprano, which is not a true soprano, but it's a different level of a soprano, so it's an alternate level. So just think of it as the in-between, micro on one end, macro on the other, and mezzo right in the middle. But macro is the largest division in terms of periodization and program design, and it can be a year. And if we're talking about the Olympics, it can be quadrennial. These folks are planning for 4 years out. Mesocycles are that in-between. When you look at a mesocycle, usually these are like 12 weeks in length, 8 weeks in length. They are wrapped around, or if you will, programmed within the context of January 1 to spring break, or off-season mesocycle during the summertime, or an in-season mesocycle when a particular sport is playing. And I'll get into that a little bit more later on. With a microcycle, microcycles can be a week in length, where you talk about all the exercises or the workouts that you do in the context of a week, or it could quite honestly just be one workout for that one day. So they talk about a microcycle ranging from 1 week to 4 weeks, which I'm okay with, but I would still put 4 weeks in with the mesocycle side of the or mesocycle grouping. I'm just used to that, and I'm used to like that kind of verbiage when I talk about training and program design. But the book, they list this, and I highlight this because it's something you'll need to remember later on. But each mesocycle is divided into microcycles, and these can range from 1 week to 4 weeks, and this can include daily and weekly training variations. So I would urge you to just kind of commit these bullet points here to memory, because you'll need them in your program design later on, but you'll also need them for a quiz question or two later on as well. So within the mesocycle periodization model, we talk about different phasing. You may recall the color-codified pyramid that we had some time ago. With that color-codified pyramid, we had kind of a Roy G. Biv thing, where it was hypertrophy on the bottom, then base strength, power, then peaking. The model that you see here is a little bit different in terms of how they have it categorized, but still the same concept. You're going from a hypertrophy phase, which is a higher volume, lower intensity, and you're progressing through all the way to a competition or peaking phase, which is a very high intensity, very specifically focused program design methodology. The one thing that we haven't talked about yet is the recovery or active recovery that you see in between mesocycles. So say you go ahead and you're training, you're working super hard, and you then get done with your season and you go right into training super hard for your next season. Well, what you would like to have is perhaps a week of active recuperation or active rest. Perhaps you're doing some sweating activities, but it has nothing to do with your sport. You're doing something out of the ordinary. Perhaps you're playing pickleball instead of playing baseball. Just something to kind of uncouple from the physical demands of your sport. But there's another component here that we haven't really talked about within the context of our class or the book is the psychological and the emotional stressors that are placed upon an athlete or a person when planning or training for a particular goal. So you have to have the uncoupling of that process on the physiological side, but also on the psychological and emotional side. It's just healthy to do so. And so you set up your programming to maybe have 8 weeks from January to spring break for your client, and then they get to go enjoy a spring break. That's their active recuperation where they get to walk on the beach and play beach volleyball or drink margaritas, whatever the heck they do on their spring break. My point to you is this. The active rest phase is kind of key in the whole periodization model because it allows for the recovery and the ability to recover. I'm sorry, I should have clicked on this before, but this is the model that you saw before, the hypertrophy-based strength, power, peaking. So I cut and pasted and put it in here on a slide for you. But when you get to a peaking phase, like we see up here at the top of the pyramid, you would give yourself a week of active rest to allow that uncoupling process, like I just mentioned. Then you go back into, depending upon the person, depending upon the sport, depending where they are in their macro cycle, what mesocycle you would put them in. Would it be hypertrophy, base strength and power? And I'll get into that a little bit here in a little bit with the next presentation, where I talk about program design for a fall sport going into winter and then spring yet again. Within periodization, you may recall we talked about cycles and phases. They also brought up variation and exercise selection. So we're now into variation and exercise selection. And there's different ways to introduce variations in, whether it's a incline bench press on one day and a dumbbell flat bench press on the next chest day, or it's heavy squats on a Thursday and then you do lighter squats on a Friday. You can mix and match your variables in terms of reps and sets and loading parameters, but also you can change your exercises. So what I just gave you were two examples of that, where we had a bench press day on a Monday, and then on a Thursday, we came back and did dumbbell bench press. So you have a variation in the exercise selection. If you're talking about the actual manipulation of rep and set combinations, you could do a heavy squat day and have high loading parameters and high total volume load on a Tuesday, but then maybe you come back on a Friday and you have different rep and set schemes and different loading parameters. So you can use your squat day or your other squat day, if you will, as a way to kind of break up the scar tissue from Tuesday. So there's different ways you can do this. I'm not saying that one is best over the other. What I will tell you, if you use all of these correctly as an integrated component, you stop looking at workouts as I'm going to go in and pound out a big chest workout today with my client, or my athletes are going to come in today's chest Monday. You scientifically map out your rep and set schemes for the next 8 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever it may be with your athletes or your clients to have rep and set schemes that are mapped out for them over the long haul. And now you have the framework on which you can compare performance to expected outcome. And I'm going to break off from here and go into the next presentation.